I'm Stacy at Transcend, and Jane's my counterpart here. And the C2D2 team, it's the California Consortium of Development and Dissemination of Knowledge. So we're not going to say that again. We'll say C2D2, but it's inclusive of Ross, who leads research at Summit, Bobby, who leads a lot of the PD for the Summit Learning Schools at Summit Learning, and Nick Namba on the phone here, who leads 21st Century Learning at Lindsay. So we're so excited to talk with you all about the partnership as well as the resources we created together. And we'll do a quick intro, and then we'll do 3 breakout groups so you guys can each rotate between the 3 resources and ask questions as they come up. If folks have questions or anything particular they want to hear about or learn from, feel free to put it in the chat, and throughout the next hour we'll try to answer them accordingly. All right, so how did we get started on this? This partnership with these 2 systems in California started when we realized that there was a lot of people interested in personalized learning. So folks were aligned with the philosophy that they believed in student agency and student choice, and believed that we should really have a more competency-based model versus an age-based model in how we support learners in school. So while that was happening, there was a challenge between understanding the philosophy, but really figuring out how to implement it in the classroom and at the school site. So as a teacher, like, what do I do differently with setting objectives in the morning? Do I do one for the class? Do I do individual ones for everybody? What does that tactically look like so we can ensure kids are goal-oriented? At the site level, do you need to change HR policies, operation policy? What do you keep versus what do you do different? A lot of that was a kind of black hole during the early years of personalized learning, and still is now for many schools trying to implement it. So Summit and Lindsay, 2 systems who have been doing this for about 10 years, got together to try to figure out both what have they learned over the past decade of trying to do this in their own system that they can codify and share out with people who are trying. How does what they're doing align best with research in the field about what's quality teaching and learning? And how can they pull all of this together as well as build something that's kind of irrelevant of governance model and location, but really be open to any school in the country to allow folks to be able to take what they learn and hopefully grow faster and move faster. So that was the kind of inception of this partnership, and the 2 systems actually worked really close together to figure out how to best partner. And when they mapped out, we did this whole research about how do they serve kids, what are their priorities, what's similar, what's different. We actually realized in this quick snapshot that there was a ton that was very similar, despite being in different locations, rural versus urban, and having very different governance structures. They had a lot that they shared in terms of how they shifted their systems to enable personalized learning. The partnership really evolved around the 2 systems kind of learning exactly what's happening in both systems, and also like reflecting internally and pushing each other through hard reflections to better think through what's best for kids. And through this, we visited Lindsay, we visited Summit multiple times over the past 2 years, and had a real chance to explore, like, what are we really seeing happening in classrooms, and what does this mean for what it takes to get to quality personalized learning? What are we seeing site leaders do that really enable them to create the conditions for personalized learning? What are the system folks helping support in terms of shifting the mindsets of expectations of teachers and students? So this was a lot of partnership and deep friendship building in this process to really get to the 3 resources that we're going to share with you around how to shift mindsets, enable different conditions for the school site, as well as classroom level look-forwards to get to quality personalized learning. So let me pause here, and my colleague Jane will talk a little bit more about the resources.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share with you a really oversimplified student impact framework. Stacy, if you can go to the next slide. So both systems, Summit in the Bay and then Lindsay in California in rural district in Tulare County, came together. And one of the interesting prompts, like Stacy mentioned, was despite having worked on it for 10 years, some of their most experienced educators were sort of still asking the question of, am I doing it right? So we knew we needed a little more specificity. And we thought we might start with understanding this, looking at this oversimplified student impact framework and figuring out where we might start. So here we can see students at the top with student outcomes being impacted by student actions, experiences, and then followed by sort of logical flow of like educators' actions and mindsets, and then to the learning site conditions, site leader actions and site leader mindsets. On the right, you'll see this group ended up creating 3 different resources. And it's helpful just to see sort of where they come into the student impact framework. So you'll be hearing from Nick talking about instructional look-fors, which is geared towards looking at what is it actually that the student is doing that we should be looking for to see whether personalized learning is happening. And then what are some educator actions that can support that student look-for? Secondarily, you'll hear from Ross, who's going to be talking about educator and leadership mindsets, and how Summit and Lindsay have been thinking about this in their own systems to prepare educators to do this work. And then last, you'll see enabling site level conditions, which is basically the place where we're saying, you know, educators have a big play in this, but there's also a lot of simultaneously site level conditions that need to be in place to support educators to do this and support the learning in the classroom. So I can give you, Stacy, the next few slides are just sort of a glimpse of this. So you'll see this is an example of the instructional look-fors. You'll see there's 6 different categories. Nick will dive into that. On the left here, you see cognitive lift. These are the student look-fors. The right side is the educator actions. We can go next to site level conditions. So you can see here, there's sort of a core set of site level conditions, that light blue. We call those central domains that sort of need to be in place, and primarily need to be in place, and then the outer domains that all need work, but don't necessarily have like a checklist order. And then lastly, the mindsets. Last slide.
Yeah.
You'll see there's a set of mindsets for educator personalized learning mindsets, and then additional site leaders on top of those mindsets that we think need to be in place. And I'll let us now go out into the break room. Stacy, do you want to set us up for that so we can get more detail on each?
Yeah, actually, while we're getting that set up, Bobby, Nick, and Ross, do you want to give a quick 30-second overview about what you're presenting in your session? And for the participants, we'll just rotate you guys about every 15 minutes through each one so you can get a little exposure and ask any questions you may have. Nick, do you want to start?
Sure. So I'll be running through, in an obviously super deep manner in 15 minutes, the instructional look-fors and all 26 of them. We'll do a really light touch on the organization of the content itself. The majority of my time will try to be spent digging into, so what? Now we have this great content. What is Lindsay actually doing with it? What are the structures that we're setting in place? What are the barriers that we've already met? What are the pitfalls that we've fallen into? And some of the learning that we've done up to this point.
I'll be focusing on the site level conditions. So just like Nick is going to teach you everything that needs to happen in a classroom in 15 minutes, I will teach you everything that needs to happen at a school site in those same 15 minutes. But it's really going to be about those conditions that need to be in place that make a particular school sort of a fertile ground in which to plant the seeds of personalized learning.
I'm going to be talking about site level mindsets for both educators and site leaders. And this is based on the fact that we found over time, as we were building out the instructional look-fors and the site level conditions, that there was often something in addition to just educator skills and conditions at the site that ended up being critical for success for personalized learning. And it was around educator and site leader mindset. So I'll be talking through the work we did there and where we landed and how you might use that tool.
All right, teams will split up in breakouts and then come back and just do a quick reflection, and then we'll be done.
All right, can you guys see my screen? You see the picture, not a blank screen? Perfect, okay. So I totally ran out of time last session, surprise, surprise. So I'm gonna go as fast as I can. I apologize, it's gonna feel very non-learner centric for the next 15 minutes. These are the 4 resources that we have. You heard 3 of them mentioned earlier. The 4th one Jane just alluded, or Stacy just alluded to, was the research component, which is in its kind of finalization stages now. So that is coming out. We're going to focus specifically on the instructional look-fors. Jane touched briefly on the 6 different principles as we went through. And one of the things that I'm reminding people is on the intro, we touched briefly on the concept of what it meant for Summit and Lindsay and Transcend to work together. And that's a piece that I am consistently bringing up as loud as I possibly can anytime we get to speak anywhere. I feel very passionately about the concept of a charter management organization and a public school district and a nonprofit working together to create what I can only say in my personal experience is some of the most relevant and useful content that I've had a chance to make. And I think that says something about our industry and some of the crossover that we need to have going forward. So that all to set up the mindset that each of the operational definitions that you see for these principles, each of the language sets that you see around the look-fors themselves, those are all pieces that were agreed upon across all the orgs, which again is something that I feel like was extremely important for us to have. The other caveat here is to say that when we see some of the look-fors, when you dig into some of the look-fors, we aren't claiming that there isn't some crossover into different principles. We gathered the best fit, the fit that we thought was the most logical, but clearly you'll see how something like connectedness flows over every single look-for. We had to drop it into what was the most logical, so don't think that they're 100% pure. There is some crossover, but we did the most logical components that we could. Through this time, you're going to hear me use words like learning facilitators. Please help me supplant the term teachers for learning facilitators. They mean something incredibly different, but that's not what the session is about. And you'll hear me use learning environments instead of schools, classrooms, and you'll hear me use learning communities instead of schools. So that's just what I'm used to. I'm going to try and fix it when we talk, but I might not do so well. The brief touch point that Jane gave you on this document is the left-hand side focuses on what we need to see, the learner behaviors that we should be seeing inside the learning environments, and the right-hand side is the educator actions. Now, we spent a ton of our time initially talking about educator actions, and that's where we found ourselves looking at other frameworks and other pieces that people had put together, and a lot of them were around learning facilitator actions, teacher actions, and yet we were trying to exude something that meant learner-centric. And so we needed to separate and very distinctly say we're going to pay deep attention to what we should see learners doing in the spaces so that we can bring light to that. And that's why we separated the two. I'll also tell you, as we go through the learning environments right now in Lindsay with the administrators, trying to see some of these, think about how we're providing feedback. All of our time is now spent looking at the learners, speaking to, articulating with the learners, very little time analyzing what the learning facilitator is doing now. And that's very purposeful in its intent around the difference between teaching and learning and whether it's actually being absorbed and exuded by the learners versus just being taught by the learning facilitator. Same concept, but something that was new for us here anyway. So one of the other challenges that we found going forward is that we don't have a lot of resources available that have videos, resources, anything specifically focused on learners and what we should see now. Now that we call out something like cognitive lift, how are we going to see that? There's stuff that doesn't exist, so I'll tell you about a project that we have that we're doing now to try and help solve that problem internally and hopefully support people externally too. This concept, something like cognitive lift, one of the barriers that we found that we had our administrators falling into was cognitive lift is all about the learners doing the work. And we found a trap where as administrators, we consistently try and pull in multiple look-fors into the conversation around, even though it's clearly around one. And so for this one, we constantly found rigor, the level of the rigor of the work the learner is doing, always getting pulled in, even though that's not the point when we're talking about cognitive lift. And the concept of learner-centric. So if it's can you have cognitive lift, learners doing the majority of the work, even though the learning facilitator gave them no choice in what they got to do? And you certainly can. And we want that type of feedback, but that type of feedback comes later on when we talk about learner agency and not about the cognitive lift. So it's just one of those little things that we've learned over time is being very specific as to what we're looking at and calibrating on that. One of the pieces in customization is appropriate challenge, making sure in personalized learning that kids are falling into the realm of their ZPD. What is best for them, not just what is best for the group. And then how do you support learners in doing that and having the strategies for this? There's about 5 to 7 of these look fors for each of these. And so this is just to give you a slight taste if you haven't gotten to dig deep into the content yet. Goal orientation. In Lindsay, 3 years ago, we were able to finally say that as a district, 6 K-8s, 1 comprehensive high school, 1 continuation high school, every single learner had a goal, could articulate that goal, which was a huge win for us. And we were super excited until we started digging into what goal orientation is really defined as. So learners being able to break down into short and long-term goals, learners being able to prioritize those goals based off of where they are in life right now, learners being able to determine what success looks like at each of those stages and articulate that as well. This is when we got to the depth around, we have learners with goals as a product, but we do not have learners that understand goal setting as a process. And that's a very big distinction that our superintendent just came out and said, it's great that we have goals, that's a huge win, and now we understand that that's not even close to what we actually want. How are we going to get this done? Which was a fun conversation and literally happened like 2 months ago. So we're still, I don't have the solution for that one yet, but we're working on it. Real world authenticity. So this is whether you're doing internships, externships, PBL, any of the named things out there that are currently existing, but making sure that learners are exhibiting real world authenticity in their learning and that it's relevant to them on a day-to-day basis. Clearly that's going to be super important for us. Interpersonal skills. So one of the things that we constantly have to counter-produce is the misconception around personalized learning just being with me in front of my computer all day long and not interacting with my peers and not solving problems as groups. And so very, very important for us to keep in here and highlight the interpersonal skills that are required while you learn, and that is something that we actually want to see inside our personalized learning environments. And these are the things that you can be doing to help support your learners in doing so. Connectedness, as I said to the last group, and I'll tell every group that I talk to, this is the one that we feel in Lindsay, you cannot authentically have the other 25 look fors if you don't have connectedness. You might have an artificial ability to have the other 25 look fors, but for learners to truly be able to personalize their learning and feel like they know what that means, they have to be deeply connected to you. They have to be deeply connected to one another and to the site. So how are you making sure that that is something that you're focusing on? And what, as an educator, can you do to exude more of those opportunities and importance to your learners? How this looks in Lindsay right now, we've already integrated this into our platform, into our learning management system. So our learning facilitators, our teachers have one side of the tool that they use for their day-to-day instruction, setting up playlists, all that kind of stuff. That's on one side of the tool. Then they flip over onto this side where they are the actual learner. And so this is acting as them in a professional learning span where we've dropped all of the look fors. Everything in here is very much live, but everything in here is not at all what it's going to look like when it's done. It'll be much more streamlined and efficient than it is right now. So this is what it looks like right now. We have the listing of the learner look for. We have the educator actions on the side. I mentioned before, there's not a lot of resources out there on the learner side of what this actually looks like. So we're trying to solve that problem by creating our own video sets of learner look for exemplars from the learner's perspective, so that we don't just have educator actions and what you should do, but you also have a way to dig in and see, what does this look like? What does it sound like from learners when they're actually doing these things? Not a lot of resources out there right now, and so we're trying to manage how to gather those, and we're literally making a bunch of those as responsibly as we can, because we don't want to sacrifice the quality. But we will not come anywhere close to getting 26 of those, even by the time we roll this out. It'll go into activities and playlists inside of the system so that learning facilitators can come in here and do learning at whatever pace they want, as well as have administrators supporting them in specific instances of learning that they might accentuate for their learning facilitators. For administrators, what this allows you to do is have your academic data and see your pacing, but it also allows you to see where's the staff capacity right now in each of these principles, and then you'd click down in the principles and look for specific information to see if there's a deficit you need to be worried about, or if you want to find something like customization where you're almost done with that principle as a staff, what else do you need to do to finally finish out that 100% so you can move it into maintenance, as well as building your own kind of feedback form that administrators will use to provide learning facilitators the feedback to set more of the conditions needed to actually exhibit the learner look-fors that we're trying to get. We get to build that system so that it's the most efficient possible that we can have. Our goal is to be able to run all of this against each other in the background, find out which learning facilitators that hold some of these look-fors more strongly are producing different types of results, whether there are look-fors that need to be addressed right at the beginning of a new learning facilitator orientation. These are all questions that we will be much more ready to answer than we are right now, which right now it's kind of a best guess strategy. This is the beauty of building everything that we're building right now. So this is the stuff that doesn't exist, but I promise you that it's coming, and this is my proof that it's coming for you. We took all of this information and prioritized this in Lindsay's context. And so we had to determine which one of these we needed to tackle first, which were both immediate needs as well as long-term needs. And then we started teaching our administrators. And so I'm gonna skip back through these. Essentially the process, this is the process. We are digging into 2 look-fors a month. This is going to take us 1.5 years to get fully implemented with our administration the way we want to. So we started last July, and we won't finish probably until December or January next year. But it'll allow us to dig into 2 look-fors each month. We spend about 3 hours per look-for just wrestling with, do I agree with this operational definition? What am I struggling with? How can I?
Before the conditions are about creating a school that provides fertile ground for personalized learning. What we've found is that those classroom level look-fors you've already explored and those mindsets are very, very hard to put in place sustainably at a school where the general atmosphere doesn't align to those pieces. And so that's what the conditions are, is how do you, what happens at a school that makes it an appropriate place to implement personalized learning. So I'm going to ask you in that conditions document to go to page 5, where you'll see a wheel type of graphic that provides an overview of all of those conditions. Can you give me a thumbs up when you get there? Take a minute and read through the different conditions on that wheel just to get a sense of the big picture here. And I'm going to ask someone to be the first person to jump in and name one condition that stands out to them as particularly interesting to dig into right now.
Empowered families and caregivers.
Awesome, good choice. Let's go there. So let's scroll down through this document and let's find the page dedicated to that. And that's going to be on page 11 on the right-hand side. I feel like it's better for us to dig into one of these conditions and actually get to talk about it a little bit rather than to just stay at that high level, because I think we'll actually discover some things, some truths that kind of transcend all of these different conditions. Take another minute or two to read through empowered families and caregivers and all of those sub-conditions underneath it. And when you're done, I'm going to prompt you to talk about what you might see at a school site that would tell you whether or not this condition was in place or the extent to which this was in place. So a minute or two of reading, and then we'll come back together to talk about that. Imagine a scenario in which you have been sent out to a school, and whoever sent you there told you, I want you to determine the extent to which this condition is in place at that school, the extent to which families and caregivers are empowered at this school. What would you look at in order to determine that? Who would you have to talk to? What documents would you look at? Where would you go on that campus? What would a visit consist of to collect evidence to determine the extent to which this is in place? Go ahead and jump in as soon as you have any thoughts on that.
One very small thing to kick the conversation off is that I would imagine that you would actually see families in the school building, which doesn't always happen.
Yeah, great point. Anyone else?
The one joyful role of parenting in schooling is not, I'm going to call your mother to tell her what you did that was bad, but rather it's this wonderful conversation that it's about collaboration regarding learning as opposed to a vessel for the bad news.
Definitely.
I think you'd probably see like a thoughtful and extended onboarding for not only for students but also for families around what it means to be a member of the community, at which parents, I assume, would be involved and not just a staff member telling families what it's like.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually more of a question, but are there ways in which parents, regardless of what means they have to access input and feedback, you have the resources to do that, whether it's cell phones or telephone calls or computers, whatever, or in-person visits, that there's always a way to have a touch point?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add that the school is in touch with what mechanisms for communication and collaboration with families actually work best for the families of the students at that school, because that's going to be dramatically different in different communities, within different cultures, what the expectations are and then the ways in which people are wanting to participate. So hopefully you're starting to really, it's sinking in. One of the things that we've realized through the process of designing these conditions, which is that the conditions themselves cannot be used as a checklist, right? You can't just give this to someone and say, do this at your school. It needs to be broken down into very specific actions that are relevant to an individual school's context. And so for us at Summit, working with schools in 40 different states, those actions can be very different from community to community, what needs to happen. And so the conditions are less about telling people what to do and more about actually building competencies, particularly in school leaders, and through them in everyone else that works at a school site, to put these things in place and to adapt them on an ongoing basis. And so I wanted to ask all of you to think for a minute, through my lens, because my job is professional development. What types of learning experiences might you provide to a school leader? So once you've done this assessment, you've determined the extent to which this is in place, you've identified some gaps. What types of learning experiences would a school leader need to have before he or she would be really empowered to make progress on this condition?
One question for you, Bobby. Should we be assuming that they already have the mindset that this is important based on what we heard from Ross?
So that's a great question. And that's where all of these different documents really come together. So I generally try to approach mindset work separately from conditions work, because yeah, if the inhibitor is the mindset, then you want to directly target that mindset, right? But once that mindset is in place, then you can dig into the conditions. But even those conditions interact with one another, which is why that shared vision and change leadership is right there in the center of that graphic of the conditions, because also you may have a school leader that has the mindset that this is important and actually has the capacity to think in productive ways about empowering families. But if they don't have a shared vision in place at their school site, or if they don't have that tactical strength as a leader of change at their school site, then they're not going to be able to do this. And so the point, Lovato, that you made is really important, because it's about identifying what is the inhibitor. Is it the leadership? Is it the mindset? Or is it just that these actions need to take place to build this condition? So let's go on this assumption then that the other things are resolved. You've got a leader that's effective. You've got a leader that knows how to manage change and has the right mindsets, but just doesn't have this in place. What are you going to expose that person to, or how are you going to develop him or her as a professional in order to do this?
My first inclination is to provide data. qualitative and quantitative. Here are your parents. Let's focus group. Let's show you what they're, just as you mentioned before, some communities of parents are very different depending on where they are. So who are they and what is important to them? And the more that exposure allows for conversation and a dimensionalizing of who that group of parents is, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very powerful anytime you can bring that data to the table. Since I just got the message that we're going to get closed down in just a minute, I'll add another thing that we do that's really important to this process and applies to all of the conditions, which is letting people see what it looks like. That's so powerful because often as school leaders, I spent many years as a high school principal myself, and you get so isolated on your own campus and you don't see the possibilities out there until you actually get out there and see schools that are doing it differently. So that's another thing as you look through these conditions that I would challenge you to do. How can you expose people to schools that are successfully implementing some of these conditions so that they can actually see what that looks like in action?
So hopefully you all have something that looks like this up on your screens. This is the educator and leadership mindsets. I'm going to give a quick overview about it, and then I want to spend most of our time actually just digging into the content and talking about how at Summit we've used these mindsets and how you might consider using them with practitioners if you're part of the school system or work closely with practitioners, or how you might think about how they're applied. So as I mentioned very briefly, these are site leader and educator mindset, educator and site leader mindsets, and they have two general groupings. So if you look at slide, or you look at the page that looks like this, that actually has the mindsets listed out, you'll see there's two categories of mindsets. One is mindsets about learners and learning, and the other is mindsets about myself and my role. And this is based on, as we were compiling the mindsets, we found that they tended to fall into two different types. And so one is sort of what educators believe is possible, and then the other is what educators believe is about themselves. And so that's what you'll see highlighted in the two different, in each of both the site leader and the educator sections. I want to speak briefly to how we developed these mindsets. And so there were three main sources that we used. The first, as Stacy spoke to, was just our own systems. And so we had, over the years of working on implementing personalized learning in our own 11 schools at Summit, as well as with our partner schools for Summit Learning, and then with Lindsay's schools in Lindsay School District, there were a set of mindsets that we saw as being especially important for that work that was just kind of like implicit in how we did things, how we hired, how we coached, how we onboarded. And so we were able to, through the C2D2 process, make some of those implicit assumptions explicit and compare our notes across the two systems. And we found that there was a lot of similarities. The mindsets that Lindsay had found to be especially important for personalized learning in their school district in Central California ended up being very similar to the mindsets that we had found being very important in our charter network in the Bay Area and Washington, as well as with the Summit Learning schools around the country. So that was one. The second major source that we relied on was we did a project with an external consulting group called FSG, and FSG went around and studied several of the Summit Learning schools that were at various stages of implementation, and they pulled out what were the key factors that differentiated successful implementation from less successful implementation. And several of the core things they pulled out ended up being related to educator mindsets and site leader mindsets. And so we were able to integrate that into this work as well. And then the third thing is Transcend facilitated a workshop for us, for Summit and Lindsay, where we looked at the site level conditions that you'll get to talk to Bobby about, and we backwards mapped what are the root causes that would lead those conditions to be more or less present. And through this workshop, we elicited additional mindsets that tended to be root causes that would differentiate successful from unsuccessful conditions. So that's a little bit of the how. I want to give everyone time now to just actually dive into the content, because it's tough to talk about something without a deeper understanding of what it is. So we're going to put 5 minutes on the clock. And again, my hope is that you'll be on slide 5 of the Mindsets resource. And please let me know if you're not able to find that. And would just love you to look through the mindsets and with these 2 guiding questions in mind. One is, which mindsets resonate for you as being especially important given your experience with personalized learning? And are there any here that you disagree with or think are missing? So I'm going to put 5 minutes on the clock, and then we'll come back together and discuss that. If you have questions in the meantime, please don't hesitate to holler. There are only 6 of us, so just let me know. What are other folks' reactions or thoughts in terms of what resonated and what they might have found didn't resonate or might be missing?
I really appreciated the I too, like Deb, haven't personally experienced working with personalized learning, but truly believe in what it represents, and so that one size fits all approach and how that does not exist. Each child brings unique talents, gifts, and abilities that just need to be cultivated. And so I really appreciate that. So the one piece that I'm curious about is around like student mindset. So I see we have leader and educator, but with this being personalized and really giving that student agency, just wondering the thought behind not having student mindsets listed.
Yeah. It's a great point. We actually at Summit, student mindsets are a part of the learning outcomes that we think about. And so they just kind of sit in a different place for us. But I completely agree with you. We think about a lot of, I mean, the parallel between site leaders and educator mindsets, a lot of these also apply to students. So when you think about, for example, every child can achieve at the highest levels, that translates for us at Summit in terms of growth mindset and self-efficacy. Like every student believing they can achieve at the highest levels. So really appreciate you calling that out. We have it captured in a different place, but we also definitely see the parallels there. And I'll highlight a few of the reasons that we've spelled these out for educators and site leaders in particular are not just so that we have access to this information, but so that we can take action with it. And so to highlight 3 ways that we have acted on these mindsets. One is when we do our hiring, and Lindsay does it a little bit with hiring, but more with their onboarding, they screen for and think about these mindsets in terms of what they're looking for from educators and site leaders. I've heard a lot of personalized learning folks say that they actually have an easier time coaching on skills, like hiring for mindsets and coaching on skills, than hiring for skills and coaching on mindsets, if that makes sense. The second is in coaching conversations. We have a framework for how instructional coaches should have coaching conversations with educators, and these mindsets are often the norms that they refer to in the coaching conversation. And then the third is when we start our summer professional development, and this gets right to your point. Is Jonta how you pronounce your first name?
Jonte.
Jonte. So Jonte, to your point about student mindsets, we actually have our first professional development session for new Summit Learning teachers over the summer, focus on student habits of success. And the way we start that session is by educators reflecting on their own habits of success, including mindsets. And we refer to many of these mindsets in that context. And then only once they've reflected on the importance of that for themselves, do they think about the importance of it for students and how to cultivate it for students. And so those are a few ways that we've tried to make this actionable, and then also tie the educator and site leader mindsets to the student level. So thank you so much for bringing that up.
So when you recruit, or say you go into a school, you would never go into a school that doesn't have these indicators present, or can you cultivate those so that people are ready to do this?
Yeah, they can be cultivated for sure. We do screen for them a little bit, and we've learned over time that if especially site leaders don't have certain mindsets about what it's going to take, it is often very difficult to coach for that later on, but they certainly can be cultivated. It's just a matter of, as we take in new Summit Learning schools, what's the investment we want to make in upfront screening, and what's the investment we want to make in coaching later on. I think for site leaders especially, it's very helpful to screen for it a little bit upfront.
Thank you.
And just feeling like oftentimes these beliefs that we have, I mean, really what we have here are kind of loosely a set of of learning principles. You know, some of these are articulated more explicitly that way, like the first one for the site leaders about adults basically do their best work when ... And I often feel, kind of to Peter's point about the parallel nature of this, that the more we have that through line, that the way that leadership teams work internally and think about learning within their team needs to parallel the way that they work with staff, needs to parallel the way that staff work with students. And the stronger that through line is, and the more explicit the principles that underlie those actions along the way, the more quickly we see progress for students. The second reaction that I had, which I often have when I see lists of mindsets, is like, it's so easy for mindset lists to kind of become action lists. So for example, when I see the third one under the teacher mindsets about myself and my role, and it says I collaborate with peers, like, well, that's an action. I believe my peers have something to contribute to my professional learning, or like, you know what I mean? Like sometimes when I see, when I write these lists, the same things happen, right? Like it's so easy to kind of jump to the observable. And I think, like, what actually do I have to believe about myself, about my colleagues, about the purpose of education? You know, you could kind of fill in the blank there in order to take that action of collaborating. Doing whatever else.
Yeah, it's a great push. And I think the wording could potentially be better in terms of how we think about the intent of that was to say something about how teachers think about their role rather than a specific action they do. But it's a helpful push. And I want to highlight there's an appendix on the following page that was our own attempt and something we've used in practice to be disciplined about not expecting a mindset to just be something you sort of tell people to do or not do, but you actually put thought to, when this mindset is less in play, what behaviors do we tend to see? And when this mindset is more in play, what behaviors do we tend to see? So that instructional coaches and folks can, in their own reflection, can think about what are the indicators I might have where I can notice when I'm more or less in this mindset. And related to that, I just want to highlight a few of the ways that we have ended up using this tool or our own adaptation of it. One is that our coaching conversations between instructional coaches and educators, the norms for those conversations are often pulled from the mindset. And so as a result, we have weekly coaching between instructional coaches and educators. They are able to, in the moment, recognize and reflect compassionately and say, you know, we agreed at the beginning of the year that we were going to be holding a mindset that children learn best as active participants in the process of acquiring knowledge. The thing I heard you say, I wonder if that's a mindset that you're in right now, or basically be able to have like re-norm around these mindsets without it just being like an expectation or an assumption about whether folks hold those mindsets fully or not. Oh, sorry, was someone say something?
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
Because something that you said about, like, we agreed that we were going to hold this mindset, like, makes it sound so easy, right? Like, okay, y'all, this mindset is really important. Let's just sort of agree to it. And in my experience, actually, like, holding to that mindset is the challenge. And, you know, often there's like an unlearning piece that's there where we have to say, like, if we don't believe X, it's not like there's an empty slate there. Like, there's another belief that is taking the place, or, you know, superseding the belief that we think might be most helpful. So how are you guys finding it effective to address that?
So it's part of the reason why I think the coaching has been able to be effective, because if someone actually holds a different belief, most of the things on this page, people will say, yes, I believe this. And it's not until they actually get into it that they can grapple with, like, well, except for in this case, or, you know, so actually being able to have that be on the table and looked at directly, as opposed to an implicit root cause where you're just talking about the symptom, ends up being quite helpful. And again, there's no judgment, or the best coaching conversations, there's no judgment. It's not, you're not in this mindset. We said you'd be in this mindset. Why aren't you in this mindset? But like, I'm curious, we agreed we believe this. Why isn't this coming out? And then the educator can authentically explore, oh, actually, it's because of this, or, oh, I didn't realize that this was a case where where this would be relevant. So I know we're